Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling cases of systematic murder in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will disturb you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned decades in the heart of Indianapolis, where a seemingly gentle grandmother defied all expectations of human decency and left a legacy so horrifying that investigators would call it one of the longest-running murder operations in the nation's history. A boarding house that promised rest and refuge, rooms that became tombs, and a woman whose smile concealed the coldest calculations of death. It was the year 1895. The United States was transforming rapidly. Electric streetcars were replacing horse-drawn carriages. Cities swelled with new immigrants seeking opportunity, and the Chicago World's Fair still lingered in the national imagination. In Indianapolis, Indiana, the situation was one of explosive growth and anonymous crowds. The city had nearly doubled in population over the previous decade, reaching over 100,000 souls. Strangers arrived daily by train, seeking work, seeking fortune, seeking simply a room for the night. And Belle Gunness would be waiting for them. But our story does not begin with Belle. It begins 20 years earlier, in a small Norwegian fishing village where the sea spray mixed with wood smoke, where survival meant hardness, and where a young girl named Brynhild Storset first learned that the world rewards those who take what they need. The fjords of Selbu, Norway, in 1859, offered little comfort. Brynhild was born into poverty, the kind that gnaws at bones during winter, that turns children old before their time, that makes death a familiar neighbor. Her family scraped existence from unforgiving soil, fishing in waters that claimed lives with casual regularity. According to local records, something happened to young Brynhild when she was in her late teens. Some accounts suggest an attack at a local dance. Others whisper of a pregnancy, a loss, a transformation. What is certain is this: the girl who left Norway in 1881 was not the same person who would arrive in America. She was harder, calculating, changed. When Brynhild Storset stepped off the immigrant ship in New York Harbor, she was 22 years old, traveling under the anglicized name Belle Paulson. The Statue of Liberty would not be completed for another 5 years, but America's promise of reinvention was already well established. For Belle, America represented something specific: opportunity without oversight, anonymity within crowds, and the chance to become someone entirely new. She moved to Chicago first, that great grinding machine of the Midwest, where stockyards and factories devoured workers and spit out fortunes. There, Belle worked as a domestic servant, learning English, learning American customs, learning the rhythms of a society built on transaction and trust. Learning, most importantly, that Americans were trusting people, dangerously trusting. In 1884, Belle married Mads Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who worked as a department store security guard. They were, by all accounts, a typical immigrant couple, hardworking, church-going, eager to climb the economic ladder that America dangled before them. They opened a confectionery shop together on Grand Avenue in Chicago. The shop burned down. They collected the insurance money and opened another shop on North Halsted Street. That shop also burned down. Insurance investigators at the time noted the pattern, but could prove nothing. Fire was common in wooden commercial buildings. Accidents happened. The Sorensens collected their insurance payments and moved on, eventually purchasing a home in the Austin neighborhood of Chicago. Belle had learned something crucial: disaster could be profitable, tragedy could be converted to cash. And the American obsession with life insurance, relatively new financial instruments designed to protect families from catastrophe, could be exploited by someone clever enough, cold enough, to orchestrate the catastrophes themselves. The couple had 4 children. 2 died in infancy, both from what doctors diagnosed as acute colitis. Belle collected insurance payments for each death. Her remaining children, Myrtle, Lucy, and later an adopted daughter, would survive, but they would grow up in a household where death was routine, where flames consumed property with suspicious regularity, and where their mother's moods shifted between maternal warmth and frightening coldness. On July 14, 1898, a date that would prove significant, Mads Sorensen died. It was the one day that 2 of his life insurance policies overlapped, a coincidence that insurance investigators found remarkable. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, though one doctor who examined the body suspected strychnine poisoning. Belle, now a widow, collected approximately $8,500, a fortune equivalent to over $250,000 today. She was 39 years old, newly wealthy, and entirely free. Within a year, Belle had moved to La Porte, Indiana, a small city 40 miles west of South Bend, nestled between lakes and farmland. She purchased a large farm property on the outskirts of town, 48 acres on McClung Road, featuring a substantial two-story house, several outbuildings, and enough distance from neighbors to ensure privacy. The property was perfect. In April of 1902, Belle married Peter Gunness, a local butcher and widower with 2 daughters. Finally, it seemed, Belle Sorensen would settle into respectable widowhood, remarriage, managing a substantial farm, raising children, becoming part of the community fabric. Peter Gunness died 9 months later. The circumstances were extraordinary. According to Belle's account, delivered with tears and convincing horror, she had been cooking in the kitchen when Peter went to check on a sausage grinder stored on a high shelf in the pantry. She heard a terrible crash. When she rushed in, she found her husband lying dead on the floor, his skull crushed, a large cast-iron sausage grinder lying beside him. It had fallen on his head, she said, a tragic accident. Peter's youngest daughter, Jenny Olson, who had been in the house at the time, told a different story to neighbors. She said she saw Belle strike Peter with something. She said her father's death was no accident, but Jenny was only 14 years old. Who would believe a grieving, confused child over a respectable widow? The La Porte County coroner ruled Peter Gunness's death accidental. Belle collected the insurance money, approximately $3,000, and Jenny Olson, she disappeared shortly after, never to be seen again. Belle told neighbors the girl had been sent to a Lutheran finishing school in California. No record of Jenny's enrollment in any California school has ever been found. The farmhouse on McClung Road settled into an unusual routine. Belle Gunness, now 43 years old, operated a boarding house, advertising rooms for rent in newspapers across the Midwest. She placed particular types of advertisements not just for lodgers, but for something more specific. In the Minneapolis Tidend, a Norwegian language newspaper, Belle placed matrimonial advertisements. In the Svenska Amerikanaren, aimed at Swedish immigrants. In the Scandinavian, in German, language papers. In English papers across Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota. The advertisements varied slightly but followed a pattern. Comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in La Porte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with a personal visit. The wording was clever. Equally well provided, suggested wealth was required, follow answer with a personal visit, ensured face-to-face meetings. and the promise of joining fortunes dangled the prospect of marriage, partnership, mutual prosperity. Men responded, many men. They arrived by train at the La Porte station, often traveling from hundreds of miles away, carrying their life savings in cash or bank drafts. They were immigrants, mostly Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, men who had spent years working in mines, lumber camps, farms, and factories, accumulating nest eggs, dreaming of retirement, hoping for companionship in their later years. They checked into Belle's boarding house. They met the widow, who was large, framed and strong, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds, but who could project maternal warmth when needed. They saw the substantial farm, the productive land, the potential for prosperity. They discussed marriage, merging assets, building a future together. And then they vanished. The first confirmed victim was John Moe, a Norwegian immigrant from Minnesota, who disappeared in December of 1906 after withdrawing $1,000 from his bank and traveling to La Porte to meet Belle. His family received letters, purportedly from John, saying he had decided to travel south for his health, that he would be in touch soon. He never was. In January of 1907, Henry Gaholt of Scandinavia, Wisconsin, withdrew his life savings and traveled to La Porte. He too disappeared after visiting the Gunness farm. His brother received a letter explaining Henry had gone to Norway unexpectedly. Henry had no reason to return to Norway. He had left nothing there. Old Budsberg of Iola, Wisconsin, arrived in April of 1907 with over $2,000 in cash. He vanished completely. Olaf Svenherud of Chicago disappeared in the summer of 1907. Andrew Helgelian of Aberdeen, South Dakota, was courting Belle through letters in late 1907. His brother Asle grew suspicious when Andrew's letters stopped abruptly after he announced his intention to visit La Porte, with his savings estimated at around $3,000. The pattern was established. The system was perfected. Men arrived with money, men disappeared, and Belle Gunness continued placing advertisements. But the murders were not limited to fortune, seeking suitors. Belle also employed farmhands, young men who needed work, who asked few questions, who performed heavy labor on the property. They too began disappearing with troubling regularity. Ray Lamfer was different. Lamfer was a small, slight man, somewhat simple-minded, who had worked as a farmhand for Belle since 1906. Unlike the suitors who came and went, Ray stayed. He performed manual labor, heavy lifting, digging, maintenance work that Belle's large farm required. He was utterly devoted to Belle, possibly infatuated with her, certainly dependent on her for employment and shelter. But in February of 1908, Belle fired Ray Lamfer. The reasons were unclear. Some suggested Ray had become jealous of the male visitors to the farm. Others claimed he had demanded more money or made inappropriate advances. Whatever the cause, Ray's dismissal unleashed something dangerous. He began drinking heavily. He made threats. He told people in La Porte saloons that he knew things about Belle Gunness, dark things, deadly things. He told anyone who would listen that Belle was a wicked woman, that men who visited her farm never left, that terrible secrets were buried on the property. Most people dismissed Ray's ravings as the bitter complaints of a fired drunk, but Ray Lamfer knew where the bodies were buried. Literally, because he had helped dig some of the graves. April 28, 1908. 3:45 in the morning, the farmhouse on McClung Road was burning. Flames consumed the two-story structure with extraordinary speed and intensity. By the time neighbors saw the orange glow against the pre-dawn sky and rushed to help, the fire was already beyond saving. By the time the La Porte Volunteer Fire Department arrived, the house was a roaring inferno, collapsing in on itself, sending columns of sparks spiraling into the dark sky. When the flames finally died and the sun rose over the smoking ruins, investigators made a grim discovery in the cellar. 4 bodies, 3 were small children, later identified as Belle's daughters Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip. They had been found together, suggesting they had huddled in terror as the flames consumed their home. The 4th body was larger, clearly an adult woman. She was headless, the skull apparently destroyed or consumed in the intense heat. The body's size and position suggested it was Belle Gunness. The community of La Porte reeled. A tragic accident. A terrible fire, a family lost. The newspapers carried the sad story. Prominent widow and her children perished in a house fire. But Sheriff Albert Smutzer had questions. Why had the fire started so suddenly and spread so completely? Why was Belle's head missing when the other bodies were relatively intact? And what about Ray Lampher, who had been seen in the area the night of the fire, who had threatened Belle repeatedly? Within hours, Ray Lampher was arrested and charged with arson and murder. The investigation should have ended there. Another crime solved, another criminal caught. But Esley Helgelian wouldn't let it end. Esley had been searching for his brother Andrew since December, when Andrew's letters had stopped after announcing his visit to La Porte. Esley had traveled from South Dakota to Indiana, had gone to the Gunness farm, had questioned Belle directly about his brother's whereabouts. Belle had been dismissive, claiming Andrew had left after only a brief visit, suggesting he might have gone elsewhere. Now, standing at the ruins of the farmhouse, Esley demanded that Sheriff Smutzer excavate the property. His brother had brought thousands of dollars to this farm. His brother had vanished here. Esley was certain Andrew's body was buried somewhere on the 8 acres. Sheriff Smutzer was skeptical. Belle Gunness was a victim, not a criminal. Still, the headless body bothered him. The questions bothered him, and Esley Helgelian's conviction was compelling. On May 3, 1908, excavation began. The first body was discovered within hours buried in a shallow grave near the hog pen, wrapped in oilcloth. It was Andrew Helgelian. The discovery electrified the investigation. If Belle Gunness had murdered Andrew, what else might be buried on this property? Sheriff Smutzer brought in work crews with shovels and picks. The farm became an archaeological site of horror. Body after body after body, they found them in the hog pen, butchered and buried in quicklime. They found them near the barn. They found them in the fields, in the chicken yard, along the property boundaries. Some were intact. Some were dismembered torsos separated from limbs, heads removed, bodies cut into pieces small enough to bury quickly and deeply. The excavation continued for weeks. Every day brought new discoveries, new horrors. Newspaper reporters descended on La Porte by the dozens, sending dispatches that made national headlines. Crowds gathered at the property's edges, morbid tourists hoping to witness the excavation of the next victim. The body count climbed, 5, 10, 15. Many victims were never fully identified. Decomposition and dismemberment made identification impossible. But investigators could piece together some identities through personal effects found with the body's watches, rings, buttons, fragments of clothing that families could recognize. John Moe, Henry Gaholt, Ole Budsberg, Olaf Svenherud, Andrew Helgelian, Thomas Lindboe, at least 6 to 8 other adult males. And children. The excavation uncovered the remains of children including, investigators believed, Jenny Olson, Peter Gunness's daughter, who had supposedly been sent to a finishing school in California. Years earlier, the final body count was never definitively established. Estimates ranged from 14 to 40 victims. The true number died with Belle Gunness, because the question of the headless body remained: was it Belle? The autopsy of the headless female body found in the cellar revealed troubling inconsistencies. The body was shorter than Belle Gunness's known height, 5 feet 3 inches versus Belle's nearly 6 feet. The body was lighter than Belle's substantial weight, approximately 150 pounds versus Belle's 200 plus. The body's teeth didn't match Belle's dental work, according to her dentist, but the body had been found wearing Belle's clothing. And human identification in 1908 was primitive at best. The La Porte community split into factions. Some believed Belle had died in the fire, perhaps a final victim of her own evil. Others believed she had staged her death, killed another woman as a substitute, set the fire, and escaped with the accumulated wealth of dozens of victims. Ray Lampher stood trial in November of 1908, charged with arson and 4 counts of murder. The trial was a sensation, covered by newspapers nationwide. The prosecution argued Ray had set the fire in revenge for being fired, killing Belle and her children in the process. The defense presented a different theory. Belle Gunness was alive. She had murdered the woman found in the cellar, killed her own children, set the fire herself, and framed Ray Lampher for her crimes. Ray's lawyer argued that Ray had been Belle's accomplice in some of the murders, had helped dispose of bodies, but had not set the fire. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Ray Lampher not guilty of murder, but guilty of arson. He was sentenced to 2 to 21 years at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. In prison, Ray Lampher told various versions of events to fellow inmates and guards. He claimed Belle had killed between 14 and 49 people. He described how she would drug men's food with strychnine or chloroform, wait until they collapsed, crush their skulls with a meat cleaver or heavy blunt instrument, then dismember the bodies for easier burial. He said Belle was the strongest person he'd ever known, capable of lifting grown men, wielding a cleaver with terrifying efficiency. He described a specific method. Belle would invite suitors to visit, feed them elaborate meals, drug the final course, and kill them while they were unconscious. She would then forge letters to the victims' families, explaining their departure to distant locations. She would cash any bank drafts or checks the men had brought, deposit the money in various accounts, and continue advertising for new victims. Ray Lampher died of tuberculosis in prison in December of 1910, taking whatever complete truth he knew to his grave. The question of Belle's fate has never been definitively resolved. The headless body was buried under a marker bearing Belle Gunness's name in the La Porte Cemetery. But reported sightings of Belle continued for decades across the Midwest and California, always a large woman, strong, featured, resembling the photographs from the farm. None were ever confirmed. In 1931, 3 years after the fire, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning a man she had lured through a matrimonial advertisement. Carlson was a large Norwegian woman whose physical features bore striking resemblance to Belle Gunness. She died before trial, and her body was placed in the Los Angeles County morgue, where a La Porte deputy sheriff traveled to view it. The deputy believed it was Belle Gunness. Others disagreed. The body was eventually buried without conclusive identification. The property on McClung Road stood empty for years after the excavations, avoided by locals, stripped of structures, left to weeds and silence. Children dared each other to walk its boundaries at night, inventing ghost stories about the murder farm, claiming to hear screams rising from the soil where so many had been buried. Eventually, the land was subdivided and sold, Houses were built. Normal families moved in. Life reclaimed the space where death had been systematically produced. But the story of Belle Gunness remains a disturbing reminder that evil is not always dramatic or obvious. It can wear a maternal face. It can speak in gentle tones. It can offer rest and refuge while preparing slaughter. Belle Gunness understood something fundamental about American society in the early 20th century. It was built on trust. Immigrants trusted that advertisements were honest. Men trusted that widows seeking companionship were sincere. Communities trusted that respectable property owners were lawful citizens. The boarding house was a symbol of American mobility and opportunity, temporary shelter for those in transition, moving towards something better. Belle perverted that symbol completely. Her boarding house was not a threshold toward new life, but toward death. Her advertisements were not invitations but traps. Her maternal warmth was camouflage for coldness that defies comprehension. The psychological profile of Belle Gunness has fascinated criminologists for over a century. She was methodical, patient, capable of long-term planning. She showed no evidence of mental illness or delusional thinking. She was entirely rational, calculating profit and risk with precision. She could mimic human emotion, grief, affection, vulnerability, while feeling none of it. In modern terminology, Belle Gunness was a psychopath of extraordinary capability. She was also one of America's first female serial killers to be documented and recognized as such, predating the term serial killer by decades. But questions remain, haunting and unresolved. How many victims were truly buried on the McClung Road property? 14 confirmed, but the fragmentary nature of many remains suggested more. Did Belle have accomplices beyond Ray Lamphur? How did she gain the physical strength to dismember adult males? Or did she have help? Where did the children's bodies come from? Were they her own offspring, victims of her earlier marriages, orphans she adopted for insurance money? And the question that refuses resolution: did Belle Gunness die in the fire, or did she walk away from the burning house that April morning, carrying decades of accumulated wealth, disappearing into anonymity, perhaps continuing her operations elsewhere under another name? We will likely never know. The headless body in the Porte cemetery keeps its secrets. To this day, the former site of the Gunness farm is remembered. Historical markers have been proposed but never erected. The community remains ambivalent about commemorating such darkness. Local historians maintain files on the case, occasionally receiving tips about Belle sightings, though all have proven false. The photographs of Belle Gunness, a large woman with sharp eyes and an unsettling smile, appear in true crime documentaries and books, her face becoming synonymous with American female serial murder. And on silent nights, when fog rolls across the fields outside La Porte, when the moon hangs low and full over farmland that once held such horror, people still speak of the murder farm in hushed tones. They still wonder how many secrets remain buried in soil that has long since absorbed the evidence of systematic slaughter. The boarding house where guests checked in but never left stands as a warning across time. Darkness can wear any face. Evil can speak in any accent. And trust, while necessary for society to function, must be tempered with vigilance. Belle Gunness understood human vulnerability and exploited it without mercy. She preyed on loneliness, on hope, on the immigrant dream of prosperity and companionship. She built a business model from murder, treating human lives as raw material for financial gain. She was efficient, prolific, and terrifyingly successful for over a decade. If this journey through one of America's most prolific murder operations resonated with you, If you find yourself pondering how such evil can hide in plain sight behind ordinary facades, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on this question. How do we balance trust and suspicion in a society built on both? Until next time, remember that history's darkest chapters often hide in the most unexpected places, and the untold hours of the past still speak to those willing to listen.